The first sign that money controlled this room was not the champagne, or the velvet rope, or the men in black at the door. It was the wristband. The observer noticed it while standing near the coat check, half in shadow, where the bass softened into a low vibration rather than a blow. A man had reached the entrance ahead of him. The doorman did not look up at his face. He looked at the watch. The watch was lifted, deliberately, the way one presents identification without touching it. A pause followed, no longer than a breath. Then the wristband appeared, already peeled, already waiting. It slid around the man's arm without a question asked, without a word exchanged. The man did not say thank you. He did not slow down. The observer watched the doorman's posture change as the man passed. A fractional relaxation, like a muscle released from strain. The watch disappeared into the dark. The door closed. Inside, the club breathed. Light pulsed in slow waves, blues and violets breaking against mirrored walls. Music filled the space but did not overwhelm it, it was tuned to conceal conversations, not drown them. The air carried layered smells, alcohol, cologne, heat, faint citrus from freshly wiped surfaces. Everything suggested care. Everything suggested control. The observer moved forward, unnoticed, as he always was. He had learned where to stand, close enough to see faces, far enough to be irrelevant. He had learned that invisibility was not given, it was practiced. The VIP sections formed a raised perimeter around the dance floor, like balconies in a private theater. Leather seating curved inward, framing the crowd below. Bottles arrived constantly, clear, dark, frosted, each delivered with ceremony. Sparklers flared and died. Names were spoken softly into earpieces. Hands passed credit cards without looking. At one table, a woman in a fitted black dress leaned toward a waiter holding a tray. She did not shout. She did not need to. "This is warm," she said, touching the bottle with 2 fingers, as if it were contaminated. The waiter glanced down. The ice bucket was half full, condensation running along its sides. He nodded once. "I'll replace it immediately." She did not move her hand away until he reached for the bottle. When he lifted it, she let her fingers linger for a second too long, as if testing whether he would pull back. He did not. He waited. She smiled, satisfied, and turned away before he had taken a full step. The observer noticed the way the waiter's shoulders tightened as he left, the tray steadied by habit alone. He noticed that the woman's companions did not react. They were watching something else, 2 men across the room, one standing too close to the other, both smiling. Security lined the walls in dark clothing, their faces carefully neutral. They were positioned where the light rarely touched them, but the observer had learned to see their outlines, the angle of a jaw, the bulge beneath a jacket, the stance that said not welcome but inevitable. One of them murmured into his sleeve. Another shifted his weight. On the dance floor, a man laughed too loudly and bumped into someone smaller than him. The smaller man turned, opened his mouth, then closed it again when he saw the watch. The laugh did not stop. It widened. A bartender poured without measuring. His eyes stayed down as a hand slid a folded bill across the counter, not a tip, not yet. The bartender did not acknowledge it. He poured faster. The observer felt the room's temperature change in increments so small they could be denied. A chair scraped the floor of a VIP booth and was not corrected. A glass tipped, spilled onto a woman's shoes, and no apology followed. She bent to wipe it herself while the man beside her continued speaking, his voice steady, confident, unbroken. Money moved constantly, but never urgently. It smoothed edges. It delayed reactions. It arrived before consequences could form. At another table, a man leaned back and snapped his fingers once. A waitress approached immediately, already nodding. "Tell him to leave," the man said, tilting his head toward the dance floor. The waitress looked where he gestured. A young man stood near the edge of the VIP boundary, eyes lifted toward the raised seats, uncertain whether he was allowed to be there. "He hasn't done anything," the waitress said, softly. It was the closest thing to resistance the observer had heard all night. The man's smile did not fade. He reached into his pocket, withdrew a card, and set it on the table without pushing it toward her. "I don't want to see him," he said. The waitress hesitated. Just long enough to be noticed. Then she picked up the card. Security moved not toward the man who spoke, but toward the man who waited. Hands touched shoulders. Words were exchanged that could not be heard over the music. The young man's face tightened, confusion flickering into embarrassment, then into something flatter. He was guided away without force. The observer noticed how no one watched for long. Eyes returned to glasses, to phones, to faces that mattered more. Above the bass, a brief argument flared near the bar, two men, close, mouths near ears. One man's hand rested on the other's chest, not pushing, not touching. A pause stretched. Someone laughed nearby, too late, too loud. The hand dropped. A security guard appeared between them as if he had been there all along. One man was turned gently away. The other stayed. The observer felt a tightening in his own chest, unshared. He had learned to recognize these moments, the ones that hovered. The ones that did not resolve, only sank lower into the room. Near the entrance, the doorman checked another watch. This one was different. Older. Less expensive. The pause lasted longer. The wristband did not appear. From inside, the observer could not hear what was said. He only saw the man's posture change, his shoulders angling inward, his smile thinning. Behind him, someone important cleared his throat. The observer noticed the table only after it had already changed the room. It was not on the floor plan. At least, not on the version the staff carried in their heads. Two couches were shifted a few inches apart. A low glass table appeared between them, brought by a runner who moved quickly and did not make eye contact. The change was subtle enough that no one commented on it, yet decisive enough that a new boundary had formed. A man took the seat as if it had always been his. He did not look around. He did not announce himself. He rested one arm along the back of the couch and let the other fall loosely over his knee. The people already there adjusted without being asked, one scooted closer to the edge, another stood and remained standing. Space reorganized itself around him. The observer watched the staff notice. A manager glanced over from the bar, eyes narrowing slightly. He spoke into his headset, listened, then nodded once. Nothing more. The music continued uninterrupted. A server changed direction mid-step and approached the new table, already smiling. "Welcome back," she said. The man did not respond immediately. He reached for a glass that had not yet been poured, held it up, inspected the inside as if checking for dust. "I didn't order this," he said, finally. The server apologized. She took the glass, replaced it with another identical one. Her hands moved quickly, efficiently. The observer saw the faint tremor in her wrist before she steadied it against the table. Nearby, a woman leaned in to speak to the man. He turned his head just enough to hear her, not enough to acknowledge her presence. When she finished, he nodded once, distracted, already looking past her. At the bar, a guest raised his voice in frustration. He had been waiting for a drink. The bartender did not look up. "Hey," the guest said again, louder. "I've been here." The bartender finished pouring, slid the drink away from him toward someone else, then turned. "I'll get to you," he said, calmly. The guest opened his mouth to protest, then noticed the man at the new table. He followed the line of sight of the bartender, the way attention bent. He closed his mouth. He stepped back. Money did not rush in this room. It arrived first. A bottle was placed on the new table, rare, dark, unlabeled to anyone who did not already know. No sparklers. No announcement. Just wait, settled into glass. The observer noticed how security repositioned themselves. One moved closer to the table, another closer to the exit. Not to protect the crowd. To shape it. A man from a neighboring VIP section leaned over the low divider, smiling broadly. "Didn't know you were coming tonight," he said. The seated man looked at him for a moment, expression unreadable. "I didn't," he replied. The smile across the divider stiffened. Laughter followed, thin and slightly delayed. On the dance floor, the displaced young man from earlier stood near the edge, watching the raised seats with a fixed expression. He held a drink he no longer seemed interested in. When his eyes met the observer's briefly, there was a flicker of recognition, then apology, as if for having looked. A server brushed past him and whispered something without stopping. His shoulders dropped. He took a step back, then another, until he was absorbed by the crowd. At the new table, the man gestured with 2 fingers. A bill appeared beneath his hand, thick, folded, uncounted. He slid it toward the server without looking at her. "Bring another," he said. She hesitated. Just long enough for the observer to see the calculation pass through her face. "Yes," she said. As she turned away, another guest reached out and caught her wrist. "Smile," he said, softly. She did. The observer noticed how no one reacted. How the music covered the word. How the hand released only after the smile had fully settled. Security watched. Not closely. Not indifferently. Precisely. Near the entrance, the man without the wristband was still there. He was speaking now, hands open, palms visible. The doorman listened, expression blank. Behind them, the important man cleared his throat again. This time, the doorman did not look at the watch. He stepped aside. And the observer felt the room tighten, as if something that had been waiting had finally been invited inside. The man who entered without a wristband did not look relieved. That was what the observer noticed first. He crossed the threshold slowly, as if the room might reconsider, and close behind him. His jacket remained buttoned. His hands stayed visible. He nodded once to the doorman, once to the security guard who had stepped aside, then paused just long enough for someone important to notice that he had arrived. Someone did. From the table that hadn't existed 10 minutes earlier, the seated man lifted his glass, not in greeting, not exactly. More like acknowledgement. The newcomer saw it immediately. His posture shifted, subtle but complete. He exhaled, then moved forward. The observer watched how the path opened. Not dramatically. No one stepped away in a rush. People simply adjusted, half steps and angles, creating a corridor without realizing they were doing it. The newcomer passed through, eyes forward, expression controlled. When he reached the table, he did not sit. "You got my message," he said. The seated man took a sip before answering. "I got a lot of messages," he replied. The newcomer nodded. He waited. Around them, conversation resumed in fragments. Laughter rose and fell. The music dipped briefly, then surged. The moment was unremarkable to anyone not standing close enough to hear the silence between words. "You said tonight," the seated man continued. "That was optimistic." "I wouldn't be here otherwise," the newcomer said. The observer noticed the phrasing. Not "I wouldn't have come." "I wouldn't be here." As if his presence itself required justification. A server approached with another bottle. She hesitated, unsure whether to interrupt. The seated man waved her away without looking. She retreated immediately. The newcomer leaned in slightly. "I need you to make something disappear," he said. The seated man smiled. Not warmly. Not cruelly. Just enough to show that he had heard worse. "That depends," he said, "on what you think disappeared means." The newcomer swallowed. His eyes flicked once, toward the observer's side of the room, then back. "Quiet," he said. "No noise. No surprises." The seated man set his glass down. He tapped the table twice with one finger. "Everything makes noise," he said. "You just pay to decide who hears it." A pause followed. Long enough for the newcomer to nod. "Of course," he said. Money appeared again. This time it was not slid. It was placed, carefully, aligned with the edge of the table. Respectful. Deliberate. The seated man did not touch it. "Not like this," he said. The newcomer stiffened. From nearby, a woman laughed sharply at something no one had said. The sound cut through the moment, then vanished into the music. The observer felt the tension shift, redistribute. "What do you want?" the newcomer asked. The seated man leaned back. "I want you to remember," he said, "that I didn't need to let you in." The newcomer nodded again. Too quickly. "I remember," he said. "Good," the seated man replied. He gestured, finally, and the bill disappeared beneath his hand. "Then sit." The newcomer hesitated. Then he sat on the edge of the couch, not fully claiming the space. His knee bounced once before he stilled it. Across the room, the bartender cracked a glass while polishing it. The sound was sharp, brief. He froze, then continued as if nothing had happened. A manager appeared instantly, murmured something, and the shards were swept away before anyone could step on them. At the bar, the guest who had waited earlier received his drink. He drank too quickly. The observer noticed security tightening their formation. One stood closer behind the new table now, just within reach. Another blocked a sightline from the dance floor. The room did not feel more dangerous. It felt more organized. At the table, the seated man leaned toward the newcomer. "Next time," he said, quietly, "don't bring problems into my house without asking." The newcomer nodded. His mouth opened, then closed. "I understand," he said. The seated man smiled again. This time, the smile held. From the edge of the room, the observer saw the waitress from earlier pause mid-step. She was watching the table without meaning to. A security guard met her eyes and shook his head once. She looked away. The observer felt it then, the shift from tension to permission. Something had been allowed. Something else had been postponed. At the entrance, the doorman checked a watch. This one gleamed under the light. And for the first time that night, the observer wondered who had just bought the silence, and what it was meant to cover. The effect of the agreement did not announce itself. There was no visible change at the table. No handshake. No raised voices. The newcomer remained seated at the edge of the couch, posture careful, as if occupying borrowed space. The seated man resumed his earlier position, one arm draped along the backrest, gaze drifting back to the room. Yet the club adjusted. The observer felt it before he could name it. A subtle easing, like a breath released too slowly to notice. Conversations grew louder by degrees. Laughter recovered its rhythm. The bass seemed to deepen, not in volume but in weight, settling into the floor. The server returned with the bottle she had been waved away from earlier. She placed it down without comment. No apology this time. No eye contact either. The seated man poured for himself first. The newcomer did not reach for his glass. He waited until one was pushed toward him. "Drink," the seated man said, not unkindly. The newcomer obeyed. Across the room, the young man who had been moved earlier was no longer visible. The observer could not remember when he had disappeared. He tried, briefly, to retrace the moment, crowd shifting, lights pulsing, a body turning sideways, and failed. At the bar, a woman leaned heavily on the counter, her voice slurred but insistent. The bartender listened, nodded, then gestured subtly to a colleague. The colleague stepped in, smiling, guiding her away with practiced ease. No one protested. No one followed. Security continued to hold their positions, but their stances softened. Hands loosened. Weight shifted back onto heels. The threat had not passed, it had simply been classified. The observer watched a small exchange near the restroom corridor. A man pressed a folded bill into a guard's hand without stopping. The guard did not look down. He stepped aside anyway. Rules bent quietly. At the table, the seated man turned his attention fully to the newcomer for the first time. "You're late," he said. "I know," the newcomer replied. Late usually means desperate. The newcomer did not argue. "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't," he said. The seated man studied him, eyes narrowing slightly, not with suspicion but with interest. "That's honest," he said. "Rare." He lifted his glass again, then paused. "You didn't bring anyone," he added. The newcomer shook his head. "No," he said. "Just me." "Good," the seated man replied. "Less to clean up." The words landed gently, but they stayed. The observer noticed how the newcomer's jaw tightened, then relaxed. He took another drink, this time too quickly. Nearby, a couple stood arguing in low voices. The man gestured sharply. The woman flinched, then smoothed her hair, glancing toward the VIP section. She noticed the table. She noticed the security. Her expression changed. She stopped speaking. The man followed her gaze. His gesture softened. His voice dropped. Whatever he had been about to say remained unsaid. Money did not intervene directly. It did not need to. Its presence was instructional. The observer felt a faint unease spread through the room, like a rumor without words. People adjusted their volume. Their movements. Their expectations. At the table, the seated man leaned closer to the newcomer. "You understand," he said, "that this doesn't make you safe." The newcomer nodded. "I'm not asking for safe," he said. "Just later." The seated man considered this. "Later costs more," he said. Another bill appeared. Thicker than the last. It joined the first without ceremony. The seated man finally looked down at the money. "Later," he said, "is now your problem." He leaned back again, conversation over. The newcomer sat still, glass in hand, eyes unfocused. For the first time since entering, he looked like someone who had arrived too early for something inevitable. The observer watched the server pass again. Her smile was gone now, replaced by something flatter, more efficient. She moved faster. She did not linger near the table. Near the entrance, the doorman spoke quietly into his radio. A reply came. He nodded once. Outside, something had changed. Inside, no one mentioned it. The observer felt the room tighten again, not sharply, not urgently, but with purpose. As if the night had been divided into before and after, and everyone present had been assigned a role without being told. At the table that hadn't existed, the seated man checked his watch. And somewhere beyond the walls, whatever had been delayed began to move. Waiting took shape in the club without anyone naming it. It appeared in the way people stopped checking their phones. In the way conversations looped, repeating themselves with slight variations. In the way drinks were finished more quickly, then replaced without enthusiasm. The observer noticed that time behaved differently near the table. The seated man no longer spoke. He watched. His gaze moved slowly across the room, resting on people just long enough for them to feel seen, not long enough to invite response. When his eyes passed over someone, that person tended to look away a beat too late. The newcomer remained where he was, posture unchanged. He had finished his drink but did not ask for another. His hands rested on his knees, fingers interlaced, knuckles pale. He was waiting the way people wait in rooms where clocks are unnecessary. A woman approached the table uninvited. She was confident, well-dressed, smiling with intention. "Mind if I sit?" she asked, already leaning forward. The seated man looked at her. Then past her. "No," he said. She laughed, lightly, as if he had misunderstood. "I mean, just for a minute." He did not repeat himself. The smile stayed on her face as she straightened, but something behind it cooled. She glanced at the newcomer, searching for an ally, found none, and stepped back into the crowd. The observer saw her shoulders tense as she walked away, saw how she did not look back. Security had noticed the exchange. One guard shifted closer to the table. Another turned his back to it, scanning the room. Protection and exclusion performed simultaneously. At the bar, the bartender stopped accepting cash tips. Cards only now. The folded bills that appeared were quietly returned, slid back across the counter with a nod that said "not here." Someone important had decided something. The observer did not know what. He only felt the effect. A man near the dance floor stumbled, bumping into a server. Her tray tipped. Glass shattered. The music masked the sound, but not entirely. The man raised his hands, laughing. "My bad," he said. The server froze. She did not look at him. She did not look at the broken glass. A manager appeared instantly. "It's fine," the manager said, already crouching. "We've got it." The server stepped back, eyes down. The man lingered, as if waiting for acknowledgement that never came. Eventually, he wandered off, still smiling, still untouched. The observer watched the cleanup happen with rehearsed speed. No questions. No blame. No pause. At the table, the seated man finally spoke again. "You see that?" he asked the newcomer, gesturing vaguely toward the bar. The newcomer nodded. "That's why you don't rush," the seated man said. "Mess makes people nervous." The newcomer swallowed. "I didn't rush," he said. "I reacted." The seated man's eyes flicked to him. "That's the same thing," he replied. Silence settled between them. The observer noticed how the room had begun to angle itself away from the table. Not physically, no one moved, but attention curved elsewhere. As if instinct had identified the center of gravity and chosen distance. A phone buzzed on the table. Not the seated man's. The newcomer's. He did not reach for it. It buzzed again. The seated man glanced down. "You should answer that," he said. The newcomer hesitated, then pulled the phone from his pocket. He stood to take the call, instinctively stepping a half-meter away. The seated man did not stop him. The observer strained to hear, but the music swallowed the words. He saw only fragments, the newcomer's shoulders stiffen, his free hand curl into a fist, the nods that came too quickly. "Yes," the newcomer said at one point. "I understand." He ended the call and stood there for a moment, staring at the dark screen. When he turned back, the seated man was already watching him. "That was fast," the seated man said. The newcomer sat down slowly. "They found it," he said. The seated man did not ask what it was. "Then waiting just got more expensive," he replied. The observer felt a ripple pass through the room, subtle but real. A few heads turned. A few voices dropped. Somewhere near the entrance, a security guard straightened, alert again. The seated man checked his watch. "Finish your drink," he said. "You won't want it where you're going." The newcomer looked at the glass in front of him. He did not touch it. And for the first time that night, the observer felt certain that whatever money had delayed was no longer willing to wait. The decision did not come with an announcement. It arrived the way all decisions did in this room, quietly, already executed by the time anyone noticed. The seated man rose from the couch without urgency, smoothing his jacket as if preparing to leave a dinner rather than conclude a negotiation. The newcomer stood immediately, too quickly, as though afraid of being left behind. "You're not coming with me," the seated man said. The words were not harsh. They were final. The newcomer stopped mid-step. "I thought," he began. "You thought waiting bought you protection," the seated man said. "It bought you time." He glanced at the watch again, more out of habit than necessity. "Time's up." The observer felt the room register the movement before it registered the meaning. Security shifted first. One guard stepped closer to the table, another toward the corridor that led to the side exit. "Not blocking. Guiding." The seated man nodded once to the nearest guard. The guard returned the gesture and turned, not toward the exit, but toward the newcomer. "This way," the guard said, already moving. The newcomer looked around, searching for something to say, someone to see him. His eyes passed over faces that avoided his gaze with professional indifference. When they reached the observer, they lingered for a fraction of a second. There was no recognition this time. Only calculation. "I didn't agree to this," the newcomer said. "You didn't need to," the seated man replied. "You needed access. You got it." The guard placed a hand lightly at the newcomer's elbow. "Not forceful. Certain." The newcomer stiffened, then allowed himself to be guided. Resistance would have changed the choreography. He understood that much. As they moved, the observer noticed how the path cleared again, not because people stepped away, but because they stopped occupying space. Bodies turned sideways. Conversations paused mid-sentence. A laugh cut off and restarted a beat later, thinner than before. Near the bar, the bartender stopped pouring and watched the movement in the reflection of the mirror behind the shelves. He did not turn around. The newcomer was led toward the side corridor, past the restrooms, past a door marked staff only. He glanced once over his shoulder. The seated man was already sitting again, glass raised, speaking to someone new. At the threshold of the corridor, the newcomer's phone buzzed again. He did not reach for it. "Can I just," he said, gesturing vaguely. "1 minute." The guard did not slow. "You're done here," he said. The door closed behind them with a soft click, almost polite. The music swallowed the sound completely. The observer waited for something to follow, shouting, a disturbance, a reaction. None came. The club continued. A server returned to the table, replacing a glass that hadn't been emptied. The seated man nodded his thanks. Someone laughed nearby, relief bleeding into the sound. At the entrance, a new guest was being wristbanded. This watch was expensive. The pause was brief. The observer felt a strange emptiness where the tension had been. Not relief. Absence. Whatever had been postponed was no longer inside the room. The seated man leaned back, satisfied, and glanced once toward the corridor. "Clean," he said. No one asked what he meant. And somewhere beyond the walls, past the lights, past the music, past the door that had closed without a sound, the cost of waiting finally began to collect interest. What followed was not escalation. It was confirmation. The observer noticed it in the smallest reactions, the way people laughed a little too quickly, the way hands stayed closer to bodies, the way no one stood still for long. Movement had become a defense. Stillness implied attention, and attention implied risk. Near the bar, 2 men spoke in low voices. One gestured with his glass toward the VIP section, then immediately lowered his hand. "Did you see?" he began. "No," the other interrupted, "too fast. Didn't see anything." They drank. The conversation shifted. A third man joined them, and the topic never returned. The observer understood then that the room was not ignorant. It was informed. Staff moved with the quiet efficiency of people who had learned what not to notice. A server dropped a napkin near the seated man's table. She bent to retrieve it, hands steady, eyes down. When she straightened, her face was blank again. Security continued their work without urgency. One guard scanned the crowd methodically, not for danger but for deviation. Another adjusted an earpiece and smiled faintly, as if reassured by what he heard. The observer watched a guest attempt to cross from the general floor into the VIP section. He was stopped gently, firmly. "Private," the guard said. The guest glanced at the table, then nodded, retreating without protest. Private meant something else here. At the seated man's table, conversation had shifted to plans, flights, hotels, a city mentioned only by its airport code. Someone laughed about traffic. Someone else complained about a meeting in the morning. The observer listened for guilt. For tension. He found neither. This was not denial. It was compartmentalization. A woman approached the table, placed a hand lightly on the seated man's arm. "You good?" she asked. He looked up at her, smiled. "I'm great," he said. She squeezed his arm once and walked away. The observer felt a chill then, not from what had happened, but from how easily it fit. Across the room, a guest dropped a glass. It shattered loudly enough to be heard even through the music. Several people flinched. Then nothing. A staff member appeared. Another followed. The glass was swept away. The space reopened. Dancing resumed. The observer noticed that no one joked about it. Earlier, someone might have. Now, silence felt safer. The seated man leaned forward, elbows on knees, scanning the room. His eyes passed over the observer again, lingering a fraction longer this time. Not with suspicion. With awareness. The observer felt suddenly visible. Not threatened, recognized. The seated man looked away. That was worse. Near the entrance, the doorman accepted another watch. This one was subtle, understated. The pause was respectful. The wristband appeared. The observer realized then that the club was not divided by wealth alone. It was divided by who could leave consequences outside, and who would carry them out. Every person still inside had made a choice, whether consciously or not. To stay. To drink. To dance. To normalize what had been removed from sight. The observer wondered, briefly, what it would take for the room to react. For someone to speak. For the music to stop. He suspected the answer was simple. More money. At the table, the seated man stood again. This time, several people rose with him. Jackets were adjusted. Phones were checked. A departure was forming. The observer felt the room lean toward the exit, not in fear but in anticipation. Something was ending. Something else was about to begin. And the observer knew, before anyone moved, that whatever came next would not happen here. It would happen where there were no witnesses. Except the ones who chose not to see. The departure did not empty the room. It rebalanced it. The seated man moved first, not toward the main exit but toward the side corridor, the one most guests never noticed, the one marked by a door that blended into the wall. Security formed around him without urgency, spacing themselves so naturally it looked coincidental. People nearby shifted aside, smiling, murmuring excuses no one had asked for. The observer stayed where he was. He had learned that following was unnecessary. Everything important revealed itself at the edges. As the group passed, fragments of conversation drifted loose. Drivers already there. 10 minutes, tops. Same place as last time. None of it sounded urgent. None of it sounded final. At the bar, someone asked for the check and was told not to worry about it. A card was waved off. A nod replaced a receipt. The bartender exhaled once the man turned away. The observer noticed a woman near the dance floor watching the departure too closely. She stood very still, drink untouched, eyes tracking the movement toward the corridor. When the door closed, she looked down at her phone and typed quickly, then deleted what she had written. She put the phone away. That, the observer realized, was the transfer. Not of money. Not of people. Of responsibility. Once the seated man left the main floor, the atmosphere shifted again. Lighter, but not relieved. Like a building after an inspection, no longer tense, but aware of its own fragility. A manager clapped his hands softly near the bar. "All right," he said, smiling. "Let's keep it moving." Music swelled a fraction louder. Lights warmed. Someone cheered for no reason at all. The observer felt the room give itself permission. Security returned to default positions. The corridor was watched, but not guarded. Whatever had required attention was now beyond the club's borders. Near the entrance, the doorman laughed quietly at something a guest said. The wristbands continued to appear. The line outside did not shorten. Inside, a man took the seat the seated man had vacated. He adjusted the cushion, placed his drink down carefully, and looked around as if measuring what the seat meant now. Across from him, someone leaned in. "Is it cool?" they asked. He shrugged. "I think so," he said. That was enough. The observer felt something settle into place, an understanding shared without language. The night would continue. Stories would be told later, softened, edited. Names would be omitted. Details would blur. No one would lie. They simply wouldn't include everything. The observer thought again of the newcomer, of the corridor, of the door that had closed without sound. He imagined the outside air, the waiting car, the quiet that followed the music. He wondered who would claim ignorance tomorrow. He wondered who would claim credit. At the bar, a guest raised a glass. "To a good night," he said. Others echoed him. The observer did not drink. He watched as money finished what it had started, not with force, not with spectacle, but with delegation. The club had done its part. What happened next no longer belonged to it. And as the observer stood there, surrounded by sound and light and carefully managed forgetting, he understood the final rule of the room. Nothing truly bad ever happens here. It just passes through. And is handed off. The night did not end. It thinned. People left in pairs and small groups, laughter trailing behind them like exhaust. Coats were retrieved. Cars arrived when summoned, engines idling just long enough to signal readiness. Names were exchanged softly near the exit, first names only, last names unnecessary. The observer stayed. He had learned that the final truth of places like this appeared after the important people were gone, when the room was no longer performing for power but cleaning up after it. Staff moved with practiced exhaustion now. Smiles faded the moment they turned away from guests. Glasses were stacked. Tables wiped. The invisible table was dismantled piece by piece, couches nudged back, the low glass surface removed, the floor beneath wiped clean as if it had never existed. The observer watched the process closely. No one spoke about what had happened. Not because it was forbidden, but because there was no language for it that wouldn't sound dramatic, or paranoid, or inconvenient. Silence was simpler. Silence was safer. At the bar, the bartender counted tips slowly, methodically. He paused at one folded bill, thicker than the rest. He unfolded it, checked the amount, then refolded it and placed it beneath the register, separate. Not joy. Not relief. Just acknowledgement. A security guard removed his earpiece and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Another stretched his shoulders, rolling tension out of joints that had memorized stillness. They spoke briefly, quietly. "Smooth night," one said. "Yeah," the other replied. "No incidents." The observer felt the word incident hang in the air, undefined and therefore unchallengeable. Near the entrance, the doorman checked his phone. A message arrived. He read it, then deleted it without replying. He glanced once at the empty doorway, then turned off the scanner. Outside, the city continued, cars, voices, footsteps, sirens far enough away to be decorative. Whatever had been transferred earlier was already dissolving into other spaces, other rooms, other explanations. The observer understood then that money did not erase consequences. It relocated them. Inside the club, the floor gleamed again. The lights softened. The music lowered to something almost gentle. It was easy, now, to believe that nothing serious had happened. Easy to believe that this place was clean. The observer finally moved toward the exit. As he passed the spot where the invisible table had been, he slowed, just for a moment. There was no mark left behind. No stain. No sign. Only space. At the door, the doorman nodded to him, not because he mattered, but because everyone deserved to be acknowledged on the way out. The observer stepped into the night air and paused. Behind him, the door closed softly. No one followed. Tomorrow, the club would open again. Bottles would arrive. Watches would be raised. Wristbands would slide into place. Staff would smile. Security would protect the same things it always protected. And somewhere else, somewhere quieter, darker, less insured, someone would pay the part of the bill that never appeared on a statement. The observer walked away knowing one final thing, the truth the room never said out loud. In places ruled by money, violence doesn't scream. It invoices. And the receipt is never issued to the one who signs the check.